What's going on, guys? Future Soul here with a quick explanation as to why I'm here. So, the video that you're about to watch is indeed Pokemon Sword and Shield versus Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. And you would think, that's a pretty big video to put out, right? And I agree. However, by the time that I finished editing this video, the DLC for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet was right around the corner. And so I thought to myself, you know, I don't think it would be a good idea to put this video out that early. I think it would be a lot better if I actually added on to it. So I went ahead and decided that I would actually go ahead and add on to the end of the video and add one more category regarding the DLCs, because at this point in time, I have finished the Indigo Disc, the last DLC for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Oh, and obviously major spoiler warning ahead, so you've been warned. So go ahead and just stay tuned for me because I will be back in just a little bit. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and let Past Soul take it away. Alright, what's good, y'all? Soul here, and welcome back to my story mode. So, the thing is, I actually wrote this script quite some time ago, well before the DLC release for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet even. Which is kind of unfortunate because there was a very specific post that I saw on Twitter that I wanted to showcase to make my point as to why I'm making this video at all. But since that's obviously not going to be the case, I'm just going to go ahead and, explain myself, like I always do. Months ago, there was a post that was showcasing the differences between the graphical style of Pokemon Sword and Shield and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Someone then went ahead to quote tweet that and then put the caption, "It's happening again." This is of course in reference to the fact or idea that every year within the Pokemon fandom or community, everyone suddenly begins to look back at the most recent game in the series and begin to believe that the previous entries were superior. Now, of course, that idea is completely subjective. If you believe that the previous entry was better, or if you believe that the current entry is better, that is completely of your own opinion. However, most people that have paid any form of attention to this community has noticed that it has become somewhat of a pattern, more prominently so since the transition to 3D. So of course, now more than ever, we have been paying very close attention to see which games stand the test of time. And then it devolves into a competition, and then an argument, and then it just kind of spirals into a big, nasty toilet. Now obviously, I am not claiming to be innocent in this by any means. Just earlier this year, we had a conversation comparing Pokemon Scarlet and Violet to the entry right before it, Pokemon Legends Arceus. In that video, we compared the two base games and compared how well they held up against one another. And in the end, despite the comparisons, I came to the conclusion that I enjoyed both games for very different reasons. They both had faults, absolutely, but they had their strengths as well. So a while back, when I heard conversations about Pokemon Sword and Shield resurfacing, I figured I'd write a script and talk about my comparisons there, but of course, I guess I got lazy? I don't really know what happened. However, we've still got a little bit of downtime before the true end of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, with part 2 of the DLC coming out on December 14th. So I figured, hey, before we end up going balls to the wall on the DLC content, why not talk about the comparisons between 8th gen and 9th gen? Because, frankly, I'm surprised this didn't happen already. Oh, and for the record, I'm not going to be talking about the DLCs, I'm only going to be talking about the base games of both Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet. We will have a DLC comparison video once the DLC has actually released for Scarlet and Violet, so stick around for that if you're interested. And lastly, since this is going to be a comparison video, we're bringing back the point system. With that, we'll be using a very similar comparison layout, much like the last time. And so, with everything in place, why don't we go ahead and answer ourselves a question. Is Pokemon Sword and Shield better than Scarlet and Violet? The first thing, much like last time, that we're going to go over is graphics. As the very first thing that you see in a video game, it's also the first thing that you absolutely have to acknowledge. And so, between the two games, who has the superior graphical style? I had to think about this one just a little bit, considering the fact that this is what sparked the conversation a couple of months ago to begin with, but I think Sword and Shield might actually have to take this one. But, it's not like it's a landslide point, absolutely not. The inconsistencies in Pokemon Sword and Shield's graphics is what sparked the conversations regarding the quality of Pokemon games to begin with. However, in my personal opinion, despite being 4 years older, it somehow surpasses Pokemon Scarlet and Violet graphically, at least in terms of aesthetics and designs of towns and whatnot. I will definitely say for sure that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet does have the edge in terms of models for characters and some Pokemon. However though, yeah, that's gonna have to take a back seat because personally, and this is just a bias and because I'm petty, the fashion sucks for the models. I can't enjoy looking at my character 90% of the time because it barely feels like my character. Meanwhile, Sword and Shield has some of the best customization options I have ever seen in a Pokemon game, and they just walked away from that for some reason. I'm so mad. I'm not going into this again. Anyway, in reality, when you really go back and look at it, the worst looking parts of Pokemon Sword and Shield are pretty much just the open areas. There are some routes that don't really look all that good, but for the most part, I think I could deign to look at that more than I could look at a lot of the open areas in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. On top of that, there are some areas that look straight up cool or beautiful even in Pokemon Sword and Shield. There was that one town that was kind of hidden within the forest, Belle and Leah, with all of those beautiful mushroom lights and stuff like that, or even the forest before it that just had this awesome atmosphere about it. And then there was places like Hammerlock City, which felt like a frickin' kingdom, and it was so fun to traverse and walk around. Even if there wasn't a tremendous amount to do, it was pretty nice to look at for the most part. It felt like there was actually an aesthetic that they were trying to go for. And, you know, I can't really say the same for any city or town in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. It never really felt like they were trying to reach for any kind of aesthetic or some kind of theme with any of the towns or cities within the game. I never really felt compelled to glance around or to explore any of the towns because A, I knew that there was going to be nothing there for me, and B, most of them, 9 times out of 10, were not very good looking. We've talked about this specific topic a couple of times before, and I do have a lot more to say on this very specific subject, so for now I'll just say, yeah, graphically speaking, it definitely takes the cakes in terms of towns. And for now, my last thoughts on this specific subject is that I personally kind of prefer the UI for menus and battles in Pokemon Sword and Shield. Because they wanted things to move a little bit quicker in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, it really felt like there was a lack of style. I don't know what it is about the vibe of being in the menu in Sword and Shield, but there's something really cozy about it. I really like the color scheme and just the layout in general. It's just very nice to me. And then, of course, when you get into a battle, it sends you to an entirely different screen. Because they did that, they were able to control how everything looked, how the Pokemon looked in battle, what the backgrounds look like, and everything along those lines. So, in turn, things were a lot less, how do I put this, messy? So, even though it took like a full 20 seconds to even get into a battle, at least it looked really nice. So, graphically, yeah, I'm gonna have to go ahead and give that one to Sword and Shield, but don't worry, we're just getting started. Let's go ahead and move on to gameplay. What had the more fun gameplay loop? What had me more hooked in? What had my teeth so sinked into that sucker that I couldn't get away? Well, I'll tell you this much, I definitely didn't play Pokemon Sword and Shield for 11 hours straight. With the proof just sitting there right now on my channel, I practically played Pokemon Scarlet and Violet non-stop when it came out. Despite any and all complaints I may have had about the game while I was playing it in the moment, I definitely barely moved from that chair half the time, and it was only when I actually really had to. Now, this one may initially seem kind of unfair, however, I personally feel like the gameplay loop in this game was much more entertaining this time around for a multitude of reasons, but one of the primary reasons is because it had the advantage of learning from Pokemon Sword and Shield's mistakes. Like I said literally just a minute ago, you get in and out of battles much quicker in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet than you ever did in Sword and Shield. Because of this, and the fact that there were no hidden encounters in the grass, things felt a lot more, I don't know if this is really the right word to use in this case, but I guess fluid, for lack of a better term. Literally, the first time that Nemona lets you go and start ripping and running to fight and catch Pokemon in the open world, yeah, you're instantly in a flow state. Or at the very least, I definitely was, because every time I would start the game up to get footage or something like that, I would just end up going around and just doing stuff, without even remembering, oh my god, I had an actual task to complete. Now, of course, when it comes to video games in general, quicker doesn't always necessarily mean better. However, in the case of Pokemon, where things always felt a little slow in some aspects, yeah, no, quicker definitely can be better. There's also the fact that raid battles, which was introduced in Generation 8, was done much better in Generation 9. Yes, a lot of raids still are very much broken, but I think that they're a lot more manageable. For one thing, I never have to worry about my CPU teammates ruining the raid for me by losing. Especially because they actually scale with the game, so they actually manage to bring decent Pokemon when the challenge arises. On top of that, doing raids with other people is much better because everybody on the field has access to the gimmick and can all fight at full strength together. When raiding takes up at least like 50 to 60% of my playtime, I would like it to function in a way that makes it fun for me. Sword and Shield absolutely did that, but Scarlet and Violet just did it way better. And finally, when it boils down to it, it's just a lot more fun to roam around in this open world on a big-ass Pokemon that can do pretty much everything that you want it to, as opposed to just running around in some areas here and there where you may have to go up and down a ladder and I don't know, there's just really not much going on in terms of routes anymore. I really don't think we can go back to that. And so, that concludes why, gameplay-wise, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet definitely gets the point. Next up is the gimmick, which I feel is a much more fair comparison this time around than when we did it with Pokemon Legends. However though, it's also just as easy to decide who gets this point. And that goes immediately over to Scarlet and Violet. I do like Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing as a gimmick, however, Terrestrialization does pretty much everything better. For one thing, like we've talked about many times in the past by now, it's way more accessible. You can use it in wild battles, you can use it against trainers, you can use it against gym leaders, you can use it against anybody that you want. Meanwhile, in Sword and Shield, you can only use it during the scripted events that it allows. In the case of 8th Gen, you can only use it during raid battles, gym leader battles, maybe the occasional big bad boss battle, and like, you know, the champion battles. Next to that, when it comes to Terrestrialization, every Pokemon has fair access. It's complete fair game. Literally any Pokemon can use any Terra type that they want to change up the battle at a moment's notice. On top of that, you can never pinpoint who's gonna be the secret Pokemon that they're gonna Terrestrialize in battle. It's way more genius. Meanwhile, in Pokemon Sword and Shield, Gigantamaxing is straight up better, and only certain Pokemon have Gigantamax forms. Therefore, there's literally no reason for you to go around Dynamaxing when you can just grab a Pokemon that is capable of Gigantamaxing. Yeah, so I don't really need to argue this point much more because this one is just immediately obvious. Point goes right over to Scarlet and Violet. The next category that I have open here is story. This is not going to be much of a conversation at all. The only reason that I'm not giving Scarlet and Violet 2 points for this is because Pokemon stories could still use some work in general. However, the point goes immediately over to Scarlet and Violet because Sword and Shield didn't have a story at all. Granted, in Scarlet and Violet, they absolutely went overboard with the triple story thing. Absolutely. But it's not like any of them were bad. Far from it. I actually found myself really excited to see how all of those storylines concluded. On top of this, we get a bonus final story with the Area Zero situation. Absolutely love to see that. With Pokemon Sword and Shield, it was one of those situations that I found myself waiting for things to get started, and then the game ended. All of a sudden, Chairman Rose decided to finally be evil, even though we all knew that he was going to be the problem going in, but he didn't cause any problems until the very last, 5 to 10 minutes of the game. But before any of that, there was legitimately nothing to follow. You went from town to town, getting your gym badges, battling the occasional rival within beat or hop, maybe the occasional Marnie the 2 or 3 times that she showed up, and that was pretty much it. We've been complaining about this for years now, but it really didn't help that Team Yell wasn't an evil team. They never showed up throughout most of the game, to be honest with you. What's funny to me, though, is that Team Star technically also wasn't evil. However, they managed to make way more compelling stories and way more compelling threats. So, Yeah, this is not a conversation at all. Now, I will give Sword and Shield this little crumb. At the very least, it had a very obvious and direct antagonist. Scarlet and Violet, on the other hand, didn't really have an antagonist at all. And yet, the android versions of the dead professors are way more compelling than Chairman Rose literally will ever be. Sorry, but no way anybody in hell is ever changing my mind on that. Scarlet and Violet has a story. Sword and Shield does not. The next topic that I have on hand here is the characters, and this one also doesn't really need much of an argument. You guessed it, Scarlet and Violet had a lot more interesting and involved characters that actually added to the overall experience. Just comparing all the rivals alone, yeah, it's pretty much no contest. Nemona clears Hop any day of the week for me. I'm sorry, but that is just clear cut. Now, I will admit, Hop definitely had a little bit of a compelling backstory being the little brother of the unbeatable champion. Bro had a lot to live up to. However, his growth, development, and conclusion to his story was not interesting to me at all. Like, every time he came up to battle me, it was like, oh god, do we have to? Like, are you sure about this, brother? Because I felt bad. I just felt guilty every single time I beat him because it was just miserable. It wasn't even a good time battling him. He was never a challenge whatsoever. It was just not a good time for anybody. And then there was your primary rival for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Nemona. Every time she popped up on my screen, I was in for a great time and I had a smile on my face every single time. She would always have a new team and some new Pokemon, and it would always be just a grand time proving to her that I was a worthy rival. It was so much fun to finally get her to the point where she could finally stop holding back. That was an amazing feeling and something none of the other rivals have ever done, ever for me. And I love that, which is one of the reasons why she's one of my favorite rivals, possibly my favorite rival in the entire franchise. Despite popular belief, I don't think that a rival has to be an asshole to be a good rival. And Nemona is living, breathing proof of that. And next to Hop, the only other characters of real note are Bede, Marnie, Leon, and Sonia. The annoying thing to me is that they all have phenomenal designs. I love the way that they look, but they have nothing going on. Nothing. Leon's character traits are that he's strong in battle and that he's unbeatable. Granted, he is more interesting than Geeta for sure. However, Nemona is also a champion because there can actually be multiple champions in this region. So, in all honesty, that's perfectly fine by me. I consider Nemona the real champion anyway, considering she already beat Geeta. So, I was never really worried about her to begin with. Sonia is kind of the replacement for the professor, considering the fact that she's the one that's kind of around, unlike the actual professor, which is never around now that I think about it. No, see, that's crazy. Until I started recording this video, I hadn't even thought about Professor Magnolia. She showed up one time, and that was it. She was gone forever. You see what I'm saying? The professors in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet were directly involved with the main plot. That is probably the biggest role any professor has ever had in any of the games. Bede is an ass, and then he got trained by the fairy-type gym leader, and he was just a little bit less of an ass. Nothing going on there. And then there's Marnie, one of the characters in the entire Pokemon franchise that I will argue has been shafted the absolute most when it comes to screen time and writing, because I love her design, but she was completely underutilized and almost never shows up. Yeah, no, that cast is an absolute mess. Scarlet and Violet, they really got it together that time around. So yeah, no, this is an absolute easy point in Scarlet and Violet's court. Okay, so I have to backtrack a little bit because I accidentally scrolled past one of the topics that I meant to talk about earlier, but I think now is a good time to talk about it. The function. This is something that we've talked about in regards to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet multiple times, but when it comes to the function between the two games, which one just manages to hold itself better together? And in this case, yeah, no, Sword and Shield actually takes the point there. Granted, this is not a very high ceiling whatsoever, considering the fact that, as I said in my review, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is the worst functioning game in the series. So it's not necessarily that Sword and Shield function better per se, it's that Scarlet and Violet barely functions. And this is very obviously because of the fact that they tried to churn out an open world game, the first in the series, with the same mindset that they went into with previous games. And so, in turn, that game feels like it's held together by popsicle sticks. I'll say it like this. I have never had Pokemon Sword and Shield crash on me. Not even one time in the 3 playthroughs that I've done with those games. On top of that, I cannot remember a single point in 8th gen where the frame rate was guaranteed to drop in any of the open areas. It happened, for sure, don't get me wrong, but it didn't happen all the time. Meanwhile, in Scarlet and Violet, there are places like the Lag Tree Thicket that are fan-named like that because they are guaranteed frame drop areas. That is not good. And lastly, the camera that you can free move around all of your battles can glitch right through the floor. You can see under the world. Do I need to say anything else? Sword and Shield gets the point. Let's go ahead and move right on from that. Now, my next category here is world, but technically I should probably say region instead because they share the same world, but they're in different regions and they're handled very differently. The question is, which one handles their region better? Here's the thing, this category was actually a little tough for me, right? Because of course, there are some aspects in which Scarlet and Violet is better, there's some aspects in which Sword and Shield are better, but there's one thing that puts everything over the top for me with one, which is why the point is going over to Sword and Shield. While Pokemon Scarlet and Violet does have very lively environments with lots of different NPCs and a lot of different Pokemon just roaming around the region, doing their own thing, kind of seemingly, quote-unquote, having their own lives, Sword and Shield actually has the environments that I would rather this amount of livelihood and stuff to be in. The first town with a gym that we ever visit in Pokemon Sword and Shield has more history embedded in the literal hills than pretty much every town or city combined in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Hands down. But check this out. The thing that really put everything over the edge for me when it came to Pokemon Sword and Shield is the way that they handle Pokemon battling. Every single time that you go into a gym and you have an entire stadium watching you, and they're all chanting along as you and the gym leader are having this epic battle with Dynamax Pokemon, that energy, that atmosphere clears most things in Scarlet and Violet. For sure. They treat Pokemon battling like an actual sport, and it feels like I'm a rookie, a newcomer on the rise that people are actually paying attention to and watching on their television every time an epic battle happens against a gym leader or something like that. And there's something really exciting about that, something that a lot of other previous Pokemon generations and newer ones are missing. Hell, I'd go as far as to say that the way that they treat Pokemon battles in Sword and Shield is the best that they've ever handled it in the entire series. You could fight with me on that one all you want, but I know for a fact that the first time you went into Milo's gym and you heard them chanting when you both Dynamaxed, you were bouncing up and down in that chair, going crazy at how epic that was. I know you did. So yeah, I won't necessarily say that that's an easy point, or even necessarily a fair point, if we're being completely honest. However, I have a thing for atmosphere, and if you give me an energy like that, it clears. I'm sorry, I like epic things. I like awesome battles over pretty much anything else in anything that I play. And when you treat what I'm doing like an epic battle that somebody else is watching, yeah, no, I'll take that any day of the week. Absolutely. Now, I was really thinking hard about this because I did have a category talking about the online aspects. However, I don't really think that makes much sense here. I'm not at all a competitive battler when it comes to Pokemon, so I can't really speak on that. However, the one thing that Scarlet and Violet has over Sword and Shield is the fact that it has, like, the MMO aspect where you and 3 other friends can run around and do everything, which is neat and all, but it doesn't really add all that much to anything for me personally. Like, yeah, it was cool to run around with everybody, but overall, we weren't really doing all that much together like I had hoped we would be. So there's really nothing to compare when you take that away, because I didn't even really use that feature that much. So we'll see what happens when we compare the next set of games. We'll play it by ear, but for now, we're going to go ahead and move on to the final topic, which is the overall experience. experience. Which game had me the most hooked? Which one had me the most excited? Which one left me with an experience that was a lot less unforgettable than the other? Yeah, no, this one is definitely going to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Like I said with Pokemon Sword and Shield, the entire time that I was playing that game, it felt like I was waiting for things to finally kick off and get started. And then all of a sudden, the game ended. I saw the credits. That was it. If you know me, you know that story is a very critical driving force for me in anything that I'm playing. I remember having an okay experience with Pokemon Sword and Shield. Absolutely, no doubt about it. However, I had a fun experience with Scarlet and Violet. Yeah, I was very annoyed with all of the glitches, all of the lag, all of the slowdown, all of the frame rate issues, all of that. However, despite all of that, I managed to get past what was missing and what wasn't working, and really focused on what was working and what I was having fun with, and at the end of the day, that clears out Sword and Shield by a frickin' mile for sure. If I want Generation 10 to learn anything from any of the previous games, I would much rather they take what was good from Pokemon Scarlet and Violet and go from there as opposed to whatever was going on with Pokemon Sword and Shield. Which, granted, wasn't the worst thing of all time, but Scarlet and Violet definitely had way more potential than Sword and Shield ever did. And you know what's crazy? When you tally up the points, it was always obvious what I thought was the better game. Hell, I knew that with myself going into this, what the better game to me was. I mean, hell, you could look at the points for yourself right now, tally them up, and guess what? You're getting the same results every time. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm complacent with the problems that we had in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Not at all. Until the day that it actually happens, I'm going to advocate that Game Freak actually get the time that they deserve and need to create these games so that nothing like Scarlet and Violet happens again, where we have all of this gold, all of this potential, and all of this fun hidden under this mess, under that muck. No more of that. However, and maybe I'm tooting my horn a little bit here, as a patient person, I've come to understand that there is potential underlying all of that, and I really think that there are some things that we can learn going forward from this game well more than anything that Pokemon Sword and Shield had to offer. Simple as that. I mean, I don't know, maybe we did take a step back with the animations for Pokemon signature moves, but besides that, yeah, we can move. Overall, if we're being real, I enjoyed both of these games, enough to play through them multiple times and to purchase their DLCs and to have a good time online, recording and talking about them for years on end. Me saying that I had a better experience with one game is not me saying that I absolutely despise the other game. I don't hate Sword and Shield by any means. It definitely had its problems, and it's definitely far from the best game in the franchise, but it definitely has its merits, and it definitely has something going for it that most of the other games didn't have during its time. So for me personally, I have reflected on the time that I have had with Pokemon Sword and Shield, whether that time be good or bad, and be grateful that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet didn't end up worse than Pokemon Sword and Shield in plenty of other aspects. But, of course, that statement is completely subjective. You do not have to agree with me. If you truly believe with all your heart that Pokemon Sword and Shield is better, I am not calling you wrong. Far from it. I would love to hear your opinion as to why you believe that, because honestly, there's probably many arguments as to why Sword and Shield could be better than Scarlet and Violet outside of the graphics and stuff like that. But for now, I am going to sit with my strange opinion that Pokemon Scarlet is superior to Pokemon Sword and Shield. But hey, that's just me. So that just about does it for this video, a video in which, I'll be completely honest, was not easy to do. Like, I had to sit here and really think, like critically remember my time with both of these games and see which experiences were better or worse for me when I was doing my playthroughs. You know what I'm saying? And the thing is, I don't have my original playthrough of Sword and Shield to look back on like I do with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I can remember my time with Scarlet and Violet more than I can with Sword and Shield, especially because Sword and Shield is like, what, 4 freaking years old now? 4 to 5 years old? Ridiculous, man. Old game now. Halfway to retro. Isn't that crazy? But either way, I've rambled enough because this video is damn near as long as my previous comparison video. And I really didn't want that to happen, and yet here we are because I talk way too much. Hold your horses, I'll take it from here, past me. Okay, so thank you, past me, you've done your job, and now it's my turn to go ahead and actually take over for the end of the video here. Before we tally things up, we have to ask ourselves one final thing. Between the DLCs for both Pokemon Sword and Shield and both Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which of the two were superior? It's funny because both of these games did the exact same strategy for both of their respective DLCs, right? The base game would come out sometime in late November, and then about a year later, both DLCs would have released by that same time. The only primary difference between the two being the wait time in between. But you know what? It doesn't really make that much of a difference because at the end of the day, I have to say, overall I had a pretty good time with all of the DLCs. In one way or another, they improved on the base games a lot. And because of those improvements and quality of life changes, it made the games worth coming back to, even after a full year has passed. And so, at some point in time, I had a good time with these DLCs. However though, one of these games had a DLC set that came out much stronger than the other. One that just gave the game a much bigger package than the other, something that I could see myself returning to time and time again, even after other games have come out. And so, I have to say, the game that gets the official point for who has the superior DLC set is gonna have to go to Scarlet and Violet. I know that must sound at least partially strange to a lot of you, especially after coming back from my previous video. Anybody that's been following me for a while now knows damn well that whenever I talk about a topic, I always talk about the good and the bad that pertains to said topic. So if you actually watched to the end of the previous video, you would know that all the goods pretty much outweighed the bads for me. And then, on the opposite end, when it comes to Pokemon Sword and Shield, I wasn't a PokeTuber yet when those DLCs dropped, so I really never got to voice my opinions on those. Now here's the thing, right? It has been a long while since I've played those DLCs, so my memory's a little hazy on a couple of aspects here and there, but I could tell you this much for certain. Sword and Shield's DLC was good. Very good even. But Scarlet and Violet's DLC blows it out of the water in pretty much any aspect I can think of. But before we get to that, I will give Sword and Shield's DLC the benefit of the doubt in two things. For one thing, the performance, like the rest of the game, is much better. It really did not take very much digging into the memory vault to remember that I had pretty much no trouble in regards to lag spikes or frame drops throughout the DLCs for Sword and Shield. And if it ever was the case, it was definitely very minute in comparison to Scarlet and Violet's. No contest. The other thing that it has over Scarlet and Violet's DLC is the fact that you have access to both DLCs pretty much right from the get-go. During any given point of a replay through Pokemon Sword and Shield, you could just stop everything that you're doing and have access to either of the DLCs right then and there. In Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, that's only the case with Part 1, because Part 2 is an immediate continuation. Which means that Part 2 of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's DLC is strictly post-game, as opposed to Pokemon Sword and Shield, where it's mid-game, or main game, or post-game, whatever you decide it to be. And while that's a little frustrating on the end of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, I still gotta say, in every other aspect, it pretty much clears for me. In terms of story, challenge, sheer scale, and quality of life improvements, yeah, no, it's no contest. Like I said in my last video, it was really frustrating to push through all that slog and stuff like that. But then again, it's just like the base game. I pushed through a lot of slog and found something really enjoyable within that DLC. Whenever I played Sword and Shield, on the other hand, DLC or otherwise, I always felt like I was waiting for something to start, and it really never felt like it did. I didn't care for Calyrex as a Pokemon, at all. I completely forgot that that Pokemon existed until recently. But you know who I am gonna remember? Terrapagos, something that's actually literally ingrained in the entirety of the story of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I can't even remember the names of the characters that showed up in the DLCs for Pokemon Sword and Shield, but you know who I am gonna remember? Kieran, Carmine, the BB League, all of them, because they actually made those characters feel really important and integral to their own unique story. It's stuff like that that really made it easy for me to give this point over to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I came out with a much stronger feeling for everything that happened in Scarlet and Violet's DLC than I did with Pokemon Sword and Shield. And that kind of applies to the base game too, which is why I wanted to tack this on to the end of this original video. These DLCs are another example of how Pokemon Scarlet and Violet has learned from the previous generation, and while it's not the perfect step up by any means, despite a lot of things, it's absolute undeniable proof that this series can still improve, and Scarlet and Violet has proved that to me in a lot of ways. And by the way, when I say improve, I don't mean in the obvious ways, like in the technical term. I'm talking about in story, in characters, in growth. All I'm saying here is that while it doesn't feel like it a lot of the time, Game Freak is listening and learning and paying as much attention as they can while developing these games going forward. I've said it 1,000 times and I'll say it 1,000 more probably throughout the course of my time as a PokeTuber. But if Game Freak just had the time that they needed, this game and these DLCs would have been a much more obvious improvement over Sword and Shield as opposed to a subtle one. But hey, that's just me. Okay, so this really wraps up my video on Pokemon Sword and Shield versus Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, DLCs and all. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think that the games and their DLCs are an obvious improvement over the previous generation, or do you think that they're an absolute downgrade, a step down, and it's absolutely unacceptable? Tell me everything that you guys are thinking in the comment section below, because you know for a fact that I am always going to be down there with you guys. But with that, it is that little clock, so I'm gonna go ahead and do just that. I would like to thank you guys ever so much for watching. I truly do hope you enjoyed. Do me the greatest favor of dropping a like and a comment, and consider subscribing for more content just like this here. And with that, gonzo. Thanks again, hope you enjoyed, and I'll be seeing you guys in the next video. Do me the greatest favor of taking good ass care, and I'll see you all next time.